They called him a nobody. Not with hate, just with habit, like you talk about dust on the windowsill. Folks passed him by without a second glance, same way they'd pass by a dried-up well or a broken fence post. He was just there, quiet, still, unseen. But the thing about nobodies is they got nothing to lose. And when sundown came and 4 armed men rode into town, that's when folks learned what a nobody can become. The town of Dry Creek sat quiet between 2 hills, the kind of place where time walked slow and the wind carried stories older than most graves. It was August, and the heat pressed down on the land like a heavy blanket. Dust rolled through the main road in lazy swirls, and the wooden signs above the saloon creaked even when there was no breeze. The sky hung low, painted in shades of faded gold and rust. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled above the dry canyon, watching and waiting. The train hadn't passed through in over a year, and the old station just sat there now, empty and sun-bleached like everything else. Dogs slept under porches. People spoke in half-whispers. Nothing ever really happened in Dry Creek, and that suited most folks just fine. But on that day, something felt different. It was in the stillness, the way the air refused to move, the way the horses twitched and pawed at the ground like they sensed trouble coming. Even the preacher, who always smiled, stayed inside longer than usual, peeking out from behind the curtain with worry in his eyes. And in the middle of it all, leaning against the post outside the general store, sat the man they called Nobody. A half-finished cigarette burned slow between his fingers. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But his eyes never left the far end of the street. Something was coming, and he knew it. His name was Eli Waite, but most folks just called him that fella. Some thought he worked odd jobs. Others figured he just drifted in and never left. No one really knew where he came from, and no one asked. He wasn't the kind of man people invited to dinner or waved at in the mornings. He kept to himself, and the town let him. He looked like someone who had seen too much and said too little. Lines marked his face not from age, but from time spent holding in pain. His clothes were worn, dusty boots, faded shirt, a hat that had seen too many storms. His hands were strong but scarred, the kind that told stories without words. He had the walk of a man who had lost something long ago, but still carried its weight. Some nights, you'd find him out by the water trough, just sitting, staring at nothing, like he was waiting for someone who'd never come. And every time the train passed through, back when it still did, he'd pause and watch it disappear down the tracks, like he was trying to remember something he'd almost forgotten. People in Dry Creek didn't trust silence, and Eli had a lot of it. So they called him a nobody, not out of cruelty, but because that's what happens in small towns. If you don't fit into a box, folks leave you on the shelf. But there was something about Eli, something buried deep, a quiet heaviness in his presence. And though most missed it, the old sheriff once said, that man seen war, not the kind with guns, but the kind that leaves you walking long after you should have fallen. And on the day trouble rolled in, Eli didn't hide. He lit a match with his thumb and waited. It started with dust, more than usual, more than wind could stir. A slow cloud rising at the edge of town, where the road split into canyon and prairie. For riders, side by side, moving like they owned the earth beneath them. Black hats, black coats, black intentions. No one recognized them, but the way they rode said enough. Inside the saloon, glasses stopped mid-air. People turned to the windows, squinting into the sun. The bartender set his rag down without finishing the bottle. No one said it, but everyone felt it. Trouble had arrived, and it was riding tall. The horses slowed to a stop just outside the general store. The tallest of the men dismounted first, boots hitting the dirt like hammers. He didn't look around, didn't tip his hat. Just walked up to the post where Eli Wade sat, like he already knew where he'd be. You still breathing, Wade? The man asked, voice low but heavy. Eli didn't move, didn't blink, just took one last drag from his cigarette and flicked it into the dirt. Looks that way. The second man chuckled. The third spat in the dirt. The fourth said nothing but kept his hand near his belt. People were watching now. From windows, from cracks in doors, from behind curtains. This wasn't their business, but it was happening in their town. The tall man leaned in close. We've got business unfinished, Eli, and we didn't ride all this way for a handshake. Eli looked up for the first time. His eyes weren't scared. They were steady. Then you rode too far. And just like that, the air got tighter. The street felt smaller. And the sun, still high in the sky, somehow felt like it was getting ready to set. Behind a crowd of eyes hiding in windows, one person stepped out. A young woman, maybe 20, maybe younger, wearing a plain cotton dress and boots too big for her feet. Her name was Clara, and she worked at the boarding house kitchen, mostly washing dishes and keeping to herself. No one had seen her speak to Eli before. No one thought she even noticed him. But now, she walked slowly across the street, her arms wrapped tight across her chest. Not in fear, more like she was holding something together inside. Eli saw her, but he didn't speak, just gave his smallest nod. Clara stopped beside him, not behind him, not away from the danger, right beside him. In that simple choice, that quiet step forward made something shift in the air. The four men noticed. Their grins faded just a little. One of them tilted his head, confused. The tall man looked her over. "You sure you want to stand there, girl?" She didn't answer. She just stared back with steady eyes. Eli didn't touch her, didn't speak to her, but something passed between them. It wasn't love. It wasn't fear. It was understanding, like two people who've both been broken in the same way. And in that silence, Clara made it clear Eli Wade wasn't standing alone. It didn't change the odds. It didn't scare the men. But it planted something in the dust, something stronger than fear. By evening, word had spread like wildfire through Dry Creek. 4 riders from the east heard they killed a marshal in Abilene. They're here for Eli, something he did back when he rode with that outlaw bunch. Girl must be crazy, standing with him like that. Gonna get herself killed. The whispers drifted from the saloon to the barber's chair, from front porches to church pews. People had opinions, but none of them offered help. They talked, judged, speculated, but stayed indoors when it counted. Old Mr. Harper, who ran the hardware store, shook his head and said, "Ain't no use protecting a man who doesn't even belong here." Mrs. Ellis from the tailor shop muttered, "That girl's bringing shame to herself, backing a nobody." Only the preacher, a quiet man with tired eyes, spoke differently. "Sometimes the ones you ignore are the ones who save you," he said to no one in particular, watching the street from behind stained glass. But fear was louder than faith. Doors were locked early that night. Lamps were blown out. Folks peeked through curtains, but kept their hands far from rifles. In Dry Creek, people liked peace, but not at the cost of picking a side. Eli didn't blame them. He wasn't asking for their help. But the weight of their silence pressed down like heat before a storm. And still, Clara stayed by his side. The town may have turned its back, but the street hadn't forgotten how to listen. The next morning came slow, like the sun was unsure if it even wanted to rise. The 4 men didn't leave. They spent the night in the livery, posted one outside the door like soldiers guarding something rotten. People expected them to ride out by morning, but they didn't. They stayed, drank black coffee from tin cups, and waited like wolves waiting for a weak step. Eli stood outside the store again. Same post, same stillness. Clara brought him water in a tin cup, then sat on the bench near him. Neither said much. Words weren't needed now. Around noon, the 4 stepped out together. Their boots struck hard against the boardwalk. Guns low on their hips, shirts open at the collar, dust still clinging to their coats. They walked toward Eli like it was a job they didn't enjoy, but knew how to finish. "Time's up, Wade," the tall one said, voice echoing across the empty street. Eli stood straight, dusted off his sleeves. "Then let's not waste it." One of the others, younger, sneered. "You gonna draw with her standing there? Or are you gonna make her take the bullet for you?" Clara didn't move. Eli stepped forward, just enough to block her from the center of the street. "She ain't part of this. You came for me, so come on." The leader smiled without warmth. "Always knew you'd die for something small." Eli shrugged. "Then you never understood what makes a man big." A breeze kicked up dust between them. For a few seconds, time held its breath. From behind shuttered windows, rifles were cocked, but not raised. Townspeople watched, too afraid to speak, too ashamed to turn away. 4 against 1, and still no one stepped in. But Eli didn't flinch. He was done being forgotten. The tall man reached for his gun slow, like he was giving Eli one last chance to run. But Eli didn't move. His hand stayed low, loose by his sides. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe hard. He just waited. Then the second man moved, quick, too quick. His hand shot toward his holster, but before his fingers wrapped around the grip, Eli drew. One shot. The second man dropped to his knees, gun still half-holstered, eyes wide with surprise. He fell forward, face in the dirt. The other three hesitated. The youngest one, nervous now, backed up a step. He ain't supposed to be that fast, he whispered. Eli didn't speak. He raised his gun again, calm, steady. The third man lunged to the side, trying to get behind cover, but a second shot rang out. This one clipped his leg, sent him sprawling behind a barrel, screaming curses and blood. Now it was just the tall man and the nervous one. The nervous one dropped his gun. I didn't sign up for this, he said, hands raised, voice cracking. I ain't dying for no old score. The tall man looked at him with disgust, but didn't stop him. The boy ran, down the street, past the livery, gone. Only two men stood now, Eli and the leader. You're still the same stubborn fool, the tall man said. Eli's voice was quiet but solid. And you're still trying to scare ghosts. The last shot didn't ring out right away. It came after a pause, after one long moment of locked eyes and heavy silence. Then thunder, and when the dust settled, only Eli was standing. For a while, no one moved. Not Eli, not Clara, not the townspeople watching from behind their curtains and cracks in the door. The street was quiet, too quiet for what had just happened. Then, one by one, doors creaked open. The preacher was the first to step out, followed by the barber, then old Mrs. Ellis. They looked at the bodies, then at Eli, standing there alone, dust on his coat, sweat on his brow, gun still warm in his hand. He didn't look like a hero. He looked tired, like a man who'd just finished something he didn't want to start. Clara stepped to his side, took his arm gently, and looked up at him, not with fear but with something else. Maybe respect, maybe something deeper. The sheriff finally showed up, out of breath and late, as always. He looked around, scratched his head, and said, "Well, guess that's that." No one cheered. No one clapped. But there was a shift, quiet, small but real. People who never said his name before now whispered it. Eli Wade, they said. He stood his ground. He faced four men and lived. Maybe he ain't a nobody after all. Eli didn't say anything. He just holstered his gun, nodded once to Clara, and walked slowly toward the edge of town. And the people, for the first time, made space for him to pass. The days that followed felt lighter, though no one said it out loud. Dry Creek didn't change overnight, but something inside it shifted. The air seemed less heavy, the silence less sharp. Eli didn't leave town. He didn't say why, and no one asked. He just stayed. He fixed the broken fence behind the general store without being told. Helped the preacher carry firewood to the chapel. Even nodded at old Mrs. Ellis when she passed by. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Clara returned to the boarding house kitchen, but now people noticed her more. They thanked her when she poured coffee. They asked how she was holding up. And every afternoon, just before the sun dipped low, she walked to the edge of town and found Eli leaning on that same post. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they just stood there, watching the wind push dust across the empty road. One morning, Eli planted a row of wildflower seeds behind the store. No one asked why. No one helped. But days later, someone left a small watering can beside them. Healing in Dry Creek didn't come loud. It came soft, like morning light through worn curtains. Like a scar that doesn't ache as much when the weather changes. And though folks didn't speak it, they began to watch Eli Wade not with fear or pity, but with something closer to quiet gratitude. He hadn't just faced four men. He'd reminded them what standing meant. A week passed, then another. The rhythm of Dry Creek slowly returned. Boots on boardwalks, bells over shop doors, kids kicking stones down the dusty road. But something had taken root, something quiet and strong. Then one afternoon, a stranger arrived. She rode in on a tired gray horse, dust clinging to her coat and sorrow sitting in her eyes. Maybe 30 years old, maybe more. No bags, no questions, just a worn look like someone who'd been running too long and didn't know how to stop. Clara saw her first, brought her water without asking. The woman drank, then said, Heard there was a man here who stood his ground. I was with him once. Back in Texas, before it all went sideways. Clara didn't speak. She just looked over her shoulder toward the general store, where Eli was hammering new hinges onto the back door. The woman followed her gaze. Tell him, I didn't forget. Just got lost for a while. That evening, Clara walked the woman to Eli. He looked at her for a long moment, then simply nodded. No questions, no anger, just recognition. And just like that, Dry Creek had one more soul staying the night. The town didn't ask who she was or what she'd done. They didn't need to. Eli had drawn a line in the dust weeks before, and now others, broken or brave, were finding their way to it, maybe for a second chance, maybe just to breathe. The flowers behind the store finally bloomed, tiny bursts of yellow and purple, stubborn against the dry earth. They didn't belong in a place like Dry Creek, but there they were, stretching toward the sun anyway. Eli knelt beside them one morning, brushing dust off the petals like they were something precious. Clara watched from the porch, coffee in hand, quiet as always. From his pocket, Eli pulled out a folded piece of paper, old, creased, nearly falling apart. He didn't open it, just stared for a moment, then placed it beneath a flat stone beside the flowers. No one knew what the paper said. Maybe a name, maybe a goodbye, maybe nothing at all. But as he stood, a breeze picked up, soft, warm, kind, and for the first time in a long time, Eli smiled. Not wide, not big, just enough to know he still had something left to give. Some men walk through life without a name, without applause, without a place carved in stone. Folks call them nobodies, ghosts with breath, faces in the crowd. But every once in a while, one of those so-called nobodies stands up. Not for glory, not for reward, just because something deep inside refuses to stay silent. Eli Wade didn't change the world. He didn't build a church or start a war. He just stood when it counted. And in doing so, he showed a quiet town what courage looks like when it has no audience. It's easy to cheer for the loud ones, the fast ones, the men with titles. But the truth is, it's the quiet ones, the ones who carry pain without complaint, who hold the world together. So next time you pass someone sitting alone, someone who don't seem to matter, remember this. The world changes every time a nobody decides he ain't.